Welcome to this online refresher course that is Concerns in Educational Research and Assessment under ARPIT 2019. I am Dr. Gaurav Rao from Mahatma Jyotiba Phule Rohilkhand University, Bareilly. I extend my greetings to you all on behalf of National Resource Center for Education, that is NRC for Education, Central University of South Bihar, Gaya. I'm here to discuss with you a very important and interesting tool of data collection, that is interview. It is expected that after you complete this session, you'll be able to conceptualize interview as a tool of data collection, understand and identify the nature and characteristics of interview, enumerate the various purposes of interview, differentiate between the different interviews, know the different factors that affects the interviews. You should also come to know some of the advantages and disadvantages of interviews as a tool. And at last, you'll be able to develop your own interview schedule. Let us start. What are interviews? Basically, interviews is a face-to-face interaction between the interviewer and the respondent to gather data by verbal communication between the two or draw the information from the respondents. They are conducted to collect data in minimum time with maximum efficiency. It is a communication between the two to elicit the desired information by the former from the latter. According to Tyler, we regard interviewing as the development of the common social act of conversation that is characterized by the concepts of precision, focus, reliability, and validity. The interviewer asks the questions pertinent to the research and the respondent answers the question. Let us talk about the functions of interviews first. As a tool for research, the two distinct functions which are peculiar in interview are descriptions and elaborations. Okay, let us see what description means. Description means interviews provides an insightful understanding of the interviewee. The long, continuous, probing interaction that describes the social belief about a particular variable by him. It elaborates the process, incidents, or an example. For example, understanding the school infrastructure as a resource for environmental education. Means, suppose I want to know what are the resources in the school available that can be used as resource for environmental education. I would like to know what are the things available. I can talk someone to describe about it, maybe the principal, maybe the teacher, maybe the students, those who are studying there. They can help me out to describe the things that the teacher uses, or the principal wants to use it. The next function is the exploration. Exploration refers to the identification and development of understanding of any unexplored variable related to the study which was not in the cognizance of the researcher. Several times the researcher finds an unidentified variable affecting the study variable. For example, problems of single father or same mother in rearing up the child. We might not come across some variables which we have not thought of when we decide or design for such study. But if we want to explore that what can be the other variables which are there, but we have not as a researcher identified it or have thought of to use it, we can go for interviewing the single father or single mother so that we can identify the various variables affecting it. Let us see what are the different types of interviews. Dear teachers, the interviews can be classified in different ways. For example, if we classify interviews based on the number of subjects and the interviewers, they can be individual or personal. When interview is done personally or individual basis, it is called the interview which is individual or personal interview. For example, studying on the idea of the university, I want to talk to the vice chancellors of the university. I'm sure that would be and that should be done individually, where I or any researcher would go and talk to the vice chancellor and talk to him one by one. And that interview would be an individual or a personal interview. The next interview type is the group interview type. When the interviews are done in a group, they are called the group interviews. Example, interviewing the group of students while conducting the SWOT of an institution. For example, many of us have come across teams coming from outside and they want to talk with the students that what are the good things they want to share about their institution where they are studying. They can also talk about some of the things like what is lacking in your institution. There a group of students are called and representing the group of students in the university, they talk about the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats of the institution. The next type of interview is the single interviewer interview, wherein one interviewer doing the interview of all the interviewee. An example of this single interviewer interview can be in clinical cases when we have to diagnose the origin of the problem, we go for this type of interview. The next interview type that you all must have had come across is the panel interview. Panel of experts conducting the interview is panel interviews. In educational research, individual or group interviews are conducted more. But in selection processes, promotions and treatment purposes, panel interviews are conducted, which I think if you have been appointed as teacher, you must have had faced the panel interview. The next category on which the classification of interviews can be done is the classification that is based on nature of interaction. The first one this category is face-to-face traditional interview, when interviewer and interviewee are present face-to-face. For example, you can study on educational status of SHG's woman, the self-help group woman, wherein the interviewer sits and talks with the women working in the self-help group individually. That is the individual face-to-face interactive interview. The next category is the telephonic interviews. When the interviews are done through telephone or the telephonic conversation, they comes under this category. They are generally now being used by the institutions as the preliminary phase of selection of teachers for the basic skill exploration. Like if a school wants to select teachers, they can have an telephonic conversation with the teachers, and if they find themselves to be having the basic skills to be a teacher, they can be called for the second stage of interview, and the other steps are taken later. The other type in this category is the computer assisted interviews, when the interviews are done through assistance of the internet or through computers. For example, audiovisual interviews, they are generally done through some apps that are being used nowadays. They are very useful in the cases where the interviewee and the interviewers are far apart, but they want to select a person, those who can help them up from that particular area. To cut the cost, we go into such interviews. The other classification category is based on the direction or focus of interview. The first category is the non-directed interview. The respondents are encouraged to talk, and interviewers, on the basis of the talk, by his wisdom, asks the question and helps him to explore the information required. Example, if we understand with this, is the study on the inclusion and mainstreaming of transgenders. Basically what happens is this, that when such groups are to be mainstreamed, peoples come across many understandings or prejudices they have come across. So we have to get into understanding of the points that are there lying behind we talk about such interviews. The next category in the same group is the in-depth interviews. The interviewer identified a problem area and then understands it deeply. For example, understanding the socio-economic effects of the child trafficking. Child trafficking has been identified by you as a problem. Now you want to know about what are the socio-economic after effects of it. So you want to do an interview. So if the problem has been identified and you want to go into a discussion on it, that is basically the in-depth understanding interview. The next category is the directed or focused interview. Example, the TV interviews. Many of you must have had come across the TV interviews where the TV interviewer asks the question and you have to answer. The control is with the interviewer and it is focused to some pre-decided areas of interest. Hence, because it is pre-decided, it is directed. The next classification may be on the basis of the nature of the structuring of the interview. Structured and standardized interview is the first type, wherein the type, number and sequence of questions are to be asked in prefixed form. On to the other side, the next category is the semi-structured can be, wherein the questions are prefixed but the sequence are not. And the last category in the category of this structure one can be the unstructured and non-standardized interview. The type, number and sequence of questions to be asked is not prefixed. I am giving you an example which can be done using all three methods. But it is you who has to decide that how and which type of structured method of interview you are going to use it. Example is interview of teachers to know about the different methods they used to teach students in their respective subjects. Dear teachers, to understand it in other words, we can say that interviews can be of two types, the formal one and the informal one. Formal interview is the one in which the questions are asked in pre-sequenced format and the responses are recorded from the research purpose. They are also called structured or pattern interview. The situation, administration and scoring requires less training and can be performed with little training very smoothly. This type of interview is expensive and time consuming, which means they are preferably conducted when the interview is informal. The results of this interview are found to be less reliable as the set are artificial, pre-planned and predetermined. On the other hand, informal interviews are not with pre-sequenced format. No predetermined questions. It is unto the interviewer to ask what as the area of study is concerned. Due to such no prefix structure, the interview is also called as unstructured interview. Unstructured interviews are basically those interviews where the probing questions are to be asked. The responses are not shared. Let me also share you that the formal and informal interviews are also named as standard and qualitative, mass and formative, inflexible and flexible, extensive and intensive, controlled and uncontrolled by various authors. Let us talk about some of the factors affecting the interviews. The first one is the characteristics of interviewer, which can be understood by two major dimensions. The first one is the subjective characteristics. As you can see that I'm very enthusiastic to talk about interview with you all people. This enthusiasm is there or not in the interviewer. Whether he have that questioning mind to ask questions and can inquire into the different dimensions of the variables and then juxtapose the pieces of information to a meaning and purposeful and a useful piece of knowledge. The second characteristic is the objective characteristics such as age, sex, culture, educational status, socioeconomic status, etc. that affects the interview process in different forms. For example, an FGD with adolescent girls and boys were not supported by researchers when the researcher is of opposite gender. What I want to say is, a focus group discussion with adolescent girls, if is done by a boy researcher, it is very difficult to come out with the basic answers. Wherein if the researcher is of the same sex, the chances of coming out with the problems of adolescent girls is higher. Hence, this is to be taken into mind that the characteristics of the interviewer is very important. The next characteristic that affects the interview is the characteristic of the interviewee. As the interview is a communication, hence the interviewee must be able to express himself or herself in words. That is, interview of the little kids, persons not able to verbalize their thoughts cannot fulfill the objective of interview. It is also to be taken care of that interview must be willing but not anxious to participate into interview. Otherwise, the findings is going to be distorted or exaggerated. For example, when asked the class 4 students, why do you like the teacher? They were not able to answer. Because they liked their teacher, but they could not verbalize their liking. Next characteristic that affects the interview is the nature of the problem under study. That means if the problem under study is not affecting or being affected by the personal life or sentiments of the interviewee, the interview is easy to conduct. For example, solution to pollution. Until unless we get affected by pollution, we don't have any interest into answering it. But the moment we get into an effect of pollution, we are more keen to find out the solutions. And such interviews will be interested by the interviewee and the answers will come genuinely. Dear teachers, there are some advantages and disadvantages of interview too. Let us take them one by one. First, the advantages. Interviews gives more flexibility in questioning the subject. When filtered the information from stakeholders, the data seems to be valid as they can be simultaneously cross-checked by the non-verbal clues given by them while interview knowingly or unknowingly. Quick and useful information can be obtained through interviews. Many events of the history is recreated through interviews. For example, causes of that problem, the problems of those problems and how they were solved. Now let us see the disadvantages. Differences in the recordings of the same response differently by the interviewer. This is a major problem that comes across interview process is that I am suppose doing the interview, I am recording differently for a particular response in different ways. Let me make it more clear. I am taking the interview and for a particular response I am reporting differently. That is because of my subjectivity. The next disadvantage is that only differences in the recordings of the same response differently by the two interviewers. Suppose me and my fellow, two of us are doing the interview, both of us are responding differently to the recorded interview. That is, my findings are different and his or her findings are different. That is the disadvantage of interviewing the person or a process by two persons simultaneously. Next is non-reliability of the responses given by the interviewee. That means the respondee is giving different answers to different interviewers at different points. That is very big problem. The next disadvantage can be the requirement of longer time for probing into the inner and hidden thoughts. Teachers, you will understand that there are some problems which really needs discussions and thoughts and times. You have to sit, share your problems, understand them up, listen them up, and then and only then you can understand their problems. For example, when you talk about the old peoples, when you talk about the societal tendencies in the subjects, and when you talk about the LGBT group subjects, where you have lesbians, gays, bisexuals and transgenders to talk on, you have to be in the group for long, and there you need to have the immersion into the discussion. That of course is a disadvantage, but I say to find out good things, giving more time is very important. The interview needs to be more skilled in asking and probing question and correlating it with the study variables. It is very difficult to quantify sometimes the interview. Why? The different questions asked to different interviews give different responses. And one thing more, there are differences in the languages which cannot be compared to each other. Let me share with you some sources of error in interview also. If the attitude of the interviewer is not supportive and intuitive, the errors are bound to creep in. Sometimes the inability of the interviewee to understand the language of the interviewer misleads the question. Also, a non-congenial relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee creates an unfaithful environment. This gives a lack of interest in the interviewee to give response. And when there is no interest, the interview seems to be very long, and hence the long duration interviews are failure. In the interview, environment is not congenial. The responses may be different from real facts. This is all for this part. I hope that you have enjoyed this session. Thank you for watching this video. Namaskar.